Hey, hi everyone. Welcome to today's discussion with Professor Kathryn Sikkink at Trinity College Dublin. My name is Donna Lyons. I'm with the School of Law, Trinity College Dublin, and this is seminar 19 in our speaker series. So Kathryn Sikkink is the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Sikkink works on international norms and institutions, transnational advocacy networks, the impact of human rights law and policies in transitional justice. Her publications include Evidence for Hope, Making Human Rights Work in the 21st Century, The Justice Cascade, How Human Rights Prosecutions Are Changing World Politics, and Mixed Signals, US Human Rights Policy and Latin America, amongst many other publications. So Professor Sikkink holds an MA and a PhD from Columbia University. She's been a Fulbright Scholar in Argentina and a Guggenheim Fellow. She's a member of the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Council on Foreign Relations, as well as a member.
If I could add now the British Academy as well.
And the British Academy, fantastic.
Just recently as a, a foreign member.
Congratulations, that's wonderful. And in addition to being a member of the editorial board of International Organization and the American Political Science Review. Kathryn, you're highly respected amongst academic students and alumni of Trinity College, and I use your writings, especially Evidence for Hope, when teaching human rights law, and these are very valuable to me and the students. So to say that your work is admired over here would be an understatement. So it's a great privilege to speak with you today. And the book that will be the subject of our discussion this evening is The Hidden Face of Rights Towards a Politics of Responsibilities, and that was published by Yale University Press last year in 2020. So in this book, Kathryn Sikkink argues that we cannot truly implement human rights unless we also recognize and practice the corresponding human responsibilities. And just to read a brief quote from the beginning of the book, you say that human rights are threatened in much of the world today, including the United States. Everywhere people and organizations have stepped forward to try to protect rights. Yet the discourse of human rights often omits the language of political and ethical responsibilities, and that absence constrains the effectiveness of rights movements. We who believe in human rights need to begin talking and thinking explicitly about the politics and ethics of responsibility. A rights and responsibilities approach is a framework and not a recipe for action. It requires us to think strategically about the networked responsibilities of many state and non-state actors, including individuals, to work collectively to implement human rights. There are risks and discomforts in emphasizing responsibilities, but the risks of inaction and complacency are worse. So my first question relates to the theoretical groundwork underpinning your argument in this book, and the relationship between this publication and your previous writings. So Evidence for Hope, which was published in 2017, was a defense of human rights, legitimacy and effectiveness against a series of critiques that you felt were unsubstantiated historically and empirically. And in this book, you elaborate recommendations for an improvement in the implementation of human rights through reclaiming responsibility within the framework of robust rights protection. So would you like to talk us through the theoretical groundwork set out in this book and how you feel that this publication ties into the important points made in Evidence for Hope?
Right. So in Evidence for Hope and in this book, I recognize that there's this great gap between our expectations, our hopes for human rights, great gap between what's written in the human rights treaties and what's actually practiced on the ground. And that gap can create, disillusionment. So Evidence for Hope tried to take on what I felt were kind of the unfair critiques, if you wish, not well substantiated critiques. But it didn't mean that I believe the human rights regime is very open to a wide range of critiques that I am more sympathetic to. And one of them has to do with this issue of the need for combining a rights approach with responsibilities. Now, I oddly came out of a piece of Evidence for Hope, because in Evidence for Hope, we argue that the human rights regime, really parts of the human rights regime came out of the global South, something that's not always recognized. And that Latin America in particular played a really important role in that. And I spent a lot of time on something called the American Declaration for Rights and Duties of Man, April 1948, the 19 Latin American states and the United States passed this American Declaration, the first intergovernmental Declaration of Rights, 8 months before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So first, no one knows that. and some authors continue to claim that human rights were imposed on Latin America against their will by Jimmy Carter, et cetera. And so I really wanted, but the piece of the history that I didn't pay quite enough attention to was that this was the American Declaration of Rights and Duties of states. And the Latin American countries actually tried to get the duties part. The rights part, they succeeded in getting many of those rights into the Universal Declaration, but they tried to get the duties part in the Universal Declaration, and they failed. And I tell the story in this book of how they failed and kind of why they failed. And then that just grabbed my interest. What was going on here in rights discourse that meant that duties had to be excluded at that point in the Universal Declaration, 1948. So that's sort of one historical origin, but then there was a philosophical origin, if you wish, and it came particularly from engaging with philosophers, and particularly I always highlight Iris Marion Young, her beautiful book, Responsibility for Justice, her posthumous book, but also authors like Honora O'Neill's Justice Across Borders, for example, that looks whose obligations, right? And realizing that that especially Iris Young says, when we face structural injustice, it's not enough to simply expect that the state has responsibilities and it will act. We have to have what she calls a social connection model of responsibility. All actors connected to a structural injustice and able to act need to take action, right? And in that, she said, she argued for a forward-looking vision of responsibility. And so here, I know I have a legal audience here, and so the first thing I have to say is, this is not about writing new human rights law to create new legal responsibilities, period. There's nothing in this book that advocates new law, okay? It's about ethical and political responsibilities that are forward-looking, not backward-looking. This is not about a normal legal liability model, who's to blame, who can be sued, who can be prosecuted. It's about how we need to work together to overcome some of these big human rights problems of the 21st century. So that's the kind of background.
Sorry, Kathryn, I was muted there. Right, so that's fantastic. And you use 5 really pertinent case studies to illustrate the linkage then between rights and responsibilities. And the first one you talk about is climate change. So you say that to address environmental crises, it's necessary to emphasize not only our rights to a clean environment, but also the obligations of states, corporations, institutions, and individuals to protect the environment. I was wondering if you'd like to talk a little bit more about how the climate change example was a good exemplar of this relationship between rights and responsibilities.
Mm-hmm. It's a couple of ways. One, of course, this entire book was written during the Trump presidency, and so part of it was shaped by that experience. And so here, all of a sudden, we had a government that was withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, right? And if we believed only states mattered, we would sort of go, oh, well, I guess we can just all wait until we have a better government before we can do something again. But of course, that was not either the response people took or the response that people had to take. And we began to see that there was lots of possibilities for state governments, municipal governments, but also all sorts of organizations. Universities were really starting to figure out how they could begin to divest from fossil fuels. And there was a move for individuals to begin to do more, to think about their footprint and do more. So we have all these incredible climate vegetarians, of course. All of our young people are, and so I think climate, that context for me, but also I think there was a growing sense that we couldn't only think about who was to blame for climate change and expect that they would be the only ones to take action to address it. But this was very much the kind of structural injustice that Iris Young was talking about. We'd reached the point where everybody socially connected to the structural injustice of climate change and able to act needed to step forward and do their share, or else we were not going to be able to deal with this issue.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating. And we have Dr. Roisin Costello joining us today. Roisin is an assistant professor with Dublin City University School of Law and Government, and her expertise includes the field of digital privacy. So she has a question for you on the case study of digital privacy. Go ahead, Roisin.
Great, it's great to see you again, Roisin.
You too, Kathryn. So, I mean, echoing so much of what Donna said, I think conceptually the book, just in its kind of theoretical underpinnings, is so fascinating for lawyers because of that idea of kind of rejecting responsibility as almost being a tripping up point of finding rights, and instead using it to shore them up. So absolutely kind of conceptually hugely interesting. In terms of privacy though, I suppose what really struck me was similarity in the book between the arguments you make, and specifically related to Cambridge Analytica and the idea of privacy being a shared resource, and how we can, I suppose, effectively apportion responsibility in that context to make sure that I suppose the existing norms, as you say, are upheld and reinforced. So my concern always in those situations, and I think a concern kind of raised more generally in the area of digital privacy, is if we're kind of, I suppose, diffusing the idea of responsibility into a broader network of actors, how do we make sure that they're, I suppose, anchoring the right value, that they're upholding privacy as kind of a maximal virtue rather than in a quite minimal way that merely kind of serves their interest? So how do we make them, I suppose, commit to a very substantive idea of privacy, even when it is sometimes against their interests, rather than merely, I suppose, rhetorically committing to it at the moment, which is what some of the concern in digital privacy is about.
And so just sort of a question back to you, Roisin. So part of what you're saying, especially with regard, let's say, to the corporate actors, right? That perhaps this approach would take some pressure off these private actors to really have them take a higher standard. Is that it?
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, the first is, of course, nothing in this book says that we shouldn't first focus on state obligations and ideally state regulation of digital privacy. And I'm a great admirer of the GDPR, for example. I benefit. We in this country benefit from it somewhat because it does govern some types of art, but I also am enough of a political realist, a political scientist, to know that I won't hold my breath till we get a GDPR in the United States. Okay, and in many parts of the world. So in Europe, you have a unique kind of foresight and regulatory capacity that most parts of the world don't have. Okay, so I would like to see a global GDPR. I'd like to see the GDPR globalized, but I don't expect to see that anywhere in the short term. And so part of what I'm saying is not to say, oh, that's the wrong way to go about it. I think that's absolutely the right way to go about it. But rather, what are we going to do while in places where we don't and can't have a GDPR right now? And so again, it becomes, making sure that a wider variety of actors are involved. But the second piece of it, and this is really around the digital disinformation piece, more than the privacy piece. And as you know, I talk about privacy and disinformation, and that is, even if we had fantastic government regulation of this area, the disinformation issue would not go away, okay? Because disinformation is spread mainly by individuals, right? And this goes to one argument of the book, is that this kind of rights and responsibilities approach is especially necessary in these areas where we have very decentralized compliance. Right. And I assigned to my students I think it's not in this book, there's a great article from Science about using Twitter, the journal Science, using Twitter to look at disinformation, and they do a great thing about distinguishing between facts and untruths, and seeing what's retweeted most. Well, untruths are retweeted, 70 times more than truths are. And it's not because of bots. They control for bots. We would all like to believe it's the bots that are spreading disinformation, but the truth is it's people who spread disinformation. And you take the bots out and disinformation continues to spread. Well, the question is, how can we use regulation? I mean, I'm going to actually, how do we use regulation to handle that without completely smothering speech? And this disinformation, some of it's hate speech, which under European law we could smother, but most of it's just lies, that wouldn't necessarily meet a definition for hate speech, right? But nevertheless are extremely destructive to our polities and societies, right? And so my feeling is we have to take responsibility for, for humans learning to not spread disinformation. It needs to start at the lowest levels of literally primary school. And the good news is it's teaching things that we faculty have long taught. Part of what we do in any university class is teach our students the difference between a good source and a bad source, and that basic training, what's a lie, what's not a lie, what's a good source, not a source, is stuff that you can start teaching young people very early so that they don't become part of this, machine, literally a machine that's cranking out disinformation.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Did you have any follow-up questions, Roisin, or is that does that cover everything?
That's so comprehensive. Thank you so much. I do have kind of one follow-up question, which is, I suppose, you speak about the life cycle of norms and that idea, and I think it's probably so interesting for us because I suppose broadly lawyers in this area more generally are so interested in the idea of kind of societal constitutionalism that Chubner speaks about, this idea that we can have a networked idea of right standards, specifically in kind of globalized digital environments. I'm really interested where you see, or what you see rather, as the sort of controlling normative standard within the kind of order you're talking about, and what our responsibility should be towards in terms of standards. So obviously as Europeans, we usually look towards the Charter more recently, and then the Convention on Human Rights. But should we be kind of, I suppose, territorializing or looking to responsibility at a kind of a local normative level? Or do you see the argument more as being towards a kind of global normative structure, more like the UN Declaration?
Well, so there's kind of two things going on here, right? You're right, the normative structure, which I would, I would very much endorse a global normative structure. I can't see how we could possibly regulate something as cross-border as a digital world and without a global normative structure. So I need that. But certain part, like for example, the European notion, which I find very appealing, that one has, what is it? A right to disappear? No, a right to
right to be forgotten.
To be forgotten, a right to be forgotten. I find that very appealing, right to be forgotten. Okay, but I have to say, like most people, we have that just doesn't. It's harder to that particular idea to resonate elsewhere, and as you know, that doesn't exist in the global normative human rights idea that you have a right to be forgotten. But what I like, people. And I say in the book, until quite recently, people were incredibly cavalier about their own privacy. And the crucial issue about Cambridge Analytica was, I think it made clear that this is not about your privacy. So this sort of saying, I don't have anything to worry about, No, it's all about how errors that individuals make about their own privacy basically abuse the privacy of thousands, can abuse, as in Cambridge Analytica, thousands and millions of others, right? So it's, you have to be concerned about privacy more generally, and take responsibility for privacy more generally.
Thank you so much, Roisin. Thanks for those fantastic answers, Kathryn. So I have a couple of questions on the other case studies, and then there'll be an opportunity for a Q&A. So anybody in the audience who does have a question, feel free to put that question into the Q&A box there. And I see one already from Sean, so thank you for that. So before we go to Q&A, Your other case studies relate to voting, freedom of speech, and sexual assault on campus. So I suppose rather than asking three separate questions, just given the time that we have, maybe I could ask them all in the one, and feel free then to emphasize whichever angles or aspects you think are most important. So in terms of voting, you talk about strengthening our political system, and that it's not enough to stress our right to vote, that we also need to practice our responsibility to vote and to help others to vote. And then in relation to right to free speech, that we need to protect that right and protest not only by exercising it, but also by practicing the responsibility not to drown out the speech of others. And then you talk about sexual assault on campus towards the end of the book, noting that the issue of sexual assault on campus requires us once again to think about the importance of multiple agents of justice. And as with all the issues you discuss, you say that I believe that everyone socially connected to this injustice bears some responsibility for the solution, including the people who have suffered harm. Are there any particular aspects of those three case studies that you'd like to speak more about, or if you'd like to talk about them all, that's great.
Well, I guess I'd like to say a few words about each, but let me just say, starting, the voting issue is at the heart of this book, and it very much grew out of my my observations of young people and very, very low voting turnout among young people in the United States. And there's a number of reasons for that, and a lot has to do with our poor electoral system, very decentralized electoral system in a world where people move. But it also, and I did do, one of the things I did were focus groups with Harvard undergrads, right, about their beliefs about whether they should vote. And I was really, this was April 2019. But I was really amazed at kind of their ambivalence. And I mean, it ran across the spectrum. There were many highly committed students around voting, but there were lots of Harvard students who were very ambivalent and who sort of said, it's confusing, it's hard to vote. And I was like going, you guys are Harvard students. If you can get into Harvard, you can figure out how to vote. And then I realized actually that a lot of people in this country were helping them get into Harvard. Their high school teachers, their tutors, their parents, their neighbors, everyone felt like it was their business to try to help these students. And yet we don't help young people in this country figure out how to vote. No one asks your children. If people ask your children, did you get into Yale? No one asks your kids, are you registered to vote? It's like that's kind of like not a polite question. And where it should be, if we care about democracy, it should be right there. So that was kind of how the vote, and by the way, students have expanded their voting dramatically in the 2018 midterms, and now we don't have all the numbers. The numbers will be coming in because there's a program that counts student votes, but there was a dramatic surge in student voting, and in some states that made the difference. So we're gonna, when we get the actual data, we'll be able to say. But the good news is that voting in young people in the United States has jumped very significantly. And I think as a result of kind of a new ethos among students that yes, they had to work together, they had to help one another, they had to prod one another, they had to make it, as one student said, cool. It's cool to vote now, and it wasn't cool to vote before, and hey, whatever it takes, I'm happy. So on, let me just say, the most controversial part of this book is the part about campus sexual assault. And it's interesting because it's gone completely under the radar. I just expected to get more pushback on this one. And the reason it's controversial is because we're talking about campus sexual assault. So I'm talking about, and I argue how many different actors have to all be involved. And I say among those actors are the potential victims of sexual assault, okay? And it's controversial because there's a lot of people in the US, at least, who will say, aha, you're blaming the victim. But what I'm saying is that it shouldn't be controversial. And here I was mainly talking about sexual assault against women, though sexual assault doesn't only happen against women, but it should not be controversial for college women to be smart about keeping themselves safe, right? But it is controversial, actually. And in particular, I present a study that was done, a very, very serious study that was done that showed that the best way to prevent sexual assault on campus is to give freshman women, most sexual assault happens to freshmen in the first 4 months, to give freshmen training it's called self-defense training, but it's not like Kung Fu. It's really to help understand the verbal and other responses to take when you discover you're in a bad situation, okay? It's shown to reduce rape, it's shown to reduce attempted rape, and it's shown to reduce harassment short of attempted rape, right? But most colleges aren't doing it. And they're not doing it because the centers on campus that are there for victims feel like it's hard for them to offer that kind of training because victims might perceive it as blaming the victim, okay? And so the argument here is that it's not, there are many responsible actors, many agents of justice here, including bystanders. We need bystander training, including men, of course, right? So we need this training that college students of all types participate in, including faculty and of course administrators on campus to create a new climate. I'm just saying one of those many things campuses need to do that would be good would be this self-defense training, okay, and that's controversial.
That's where the terminology is important, I suppose, around your definition of responsibility. You're not saying that victims are at fault if something happens, but it's okay to be proactive, and it's that form of responsibility that should be encouraged.
Exactly. So this is the forward-looking responsibility, social connection, forward-looking responsibility. All actors connected to this injustice of sexual assault on campus need to be working together to try to prevent it in the future. Yeah. Right.
And is there anything you wanted to talk to say in relation to freedom of speech before we get to the Q&A, or do you feel that that's been covered?
Very interesting about how freedom of speech has become like the new issue of the right in the United States, right? When I was writing this, we didn't really see Trump as the great defender of freedom of speech. So that debate has become even more politicized, right? But I think, the basic issue is obviously, you have rights and responsibilities, right? And both with speech, you have a right to speech, you have a responsibility to respect the speech of others, but also, with your speech, your right to speech is not unlimited, right? And it does not let you incite riots. It does not let you, as we say, call fire in a crowded theater, right? And so with speech comes responsibility, both to listen to the speech of others, but also to constrain, to make sure you're not creating a harm to others, literally physical harm to others through your speech.
Fascinating, thank you. So I'll take a question then from the Q&A box. So thanks, Sean. Sean says, brilliant, and thank you for this exchange, but surely it is more a question of personal and corporate responsibility. I think this probably was typed when you were speaking to Roshi. So Sean says that for far too long, people speak about my rights, my freedom of speech, etc. But my question is, how do we imbue people with this sense of responsibility, given the huge range of economic conditions that people live in? Any thoughts on that?
Well, okay, so Sean, that's a great question. And one of the things I say in the book, and again, this is something I take from Iris Marion Young, is that obviously there'll be different responsibilities for people in different positions, social positions. And Young in particular talks about the importance of power and privilege, for example, but also she talks about collective interest, for example. And so when I talk about climate change, in the chapter on climate change, for example, I say, the 10% wealthiest people in the world create 49% of lifestyle emissions. So yes, I believe the 10% wealthiest people in the world have much more responsibility than do the percent poorest people in the world who produce 10% of lifestyle emissions. Okay. Now, the odd thing is, in the old days, it was always like divided by countries, right? It was the wealthy countries versus the non. But nowadays, we realize that those 10% richest people in the world are now increasingly spread around the world. And so it doesn't help to just talk about countries. We need to talk about groups, in this case, wealthy people who are more likely to emit. So my book is written thinking about, and in some ways it's addressed to people of privilege, right? And so, for example, this is why I'm hard on the Harvard students, because I think they're privileged, and for them to say, oh, it's too hard to vote, you just sort of feel like, I'm sorry, you guys are in a position to be able to figure it out and learn how to vote. Young also says that sometimes it's not just power and privilege, it may be this collective ability to act or a collective interest. So partly I'm arguing that, women on campus have a collective interest in preventing sexual assault, right? And that they could bring that collective interest to bear. For example, Young illustrates her points by looking at the sweatshop campaign. She looks at who can have an influence on sweatshops in the world. And she said, for example, students, it turns out, can have, there's all of these, in our country, I don't think, you don't have like sweatshirts as much as we do here with campus names on them, right? The University of Dublin doesn't have its sweatshirts.
They exist more so than they used to, but I think they're more common over there, yeah.
Okay, but so it's a huge industry to market your brand, your university brand name on clothes. And it turned out that a lot of those clothes were being produced in sweatshops, right? So the students organized and they said, no, these are being sold on our campus stores. This is our name brand on there. And we have a say in what the labor conditions where they are created. And they were able to actually get their universities to really look into the supply chain issue and make sure that there wasn't sweatshop labor. So that would mean these students are not powerful in one sense, but with regard to that issue, they did have a unique position to bring pressure to bear.
Right. Well, that ties in well to a question that Leon asks in the Q&A, and coming back to this question around terminology and the use of the word responsibility. So Leon asks, why did you use responsibilities instead of duties in the book title? And he says, thank you for the wonderful talk.
Yeah. I actually have a whole section of chapter 2 that just talks about why use responsibilities, not duties and not obligations. So all three of those terms sometimes are used interchangeably. So when I said that the responsibilities is the newest of the words, duties is a very old word and is associated both with hierarchy. Okay, it comes out of the Old French, which had to do with what was owed to the feudal lord. And it also is associated with religion. Okay, and so if you're trying to launch a campaign to get people to take their responsibility seriously, the best way to spoil your campaign is to use the word duties. It just turns everybody off because it carries this religious and hierarchical overtone with it, right? Obligations, there's kind of a legal dispute here about whether obligations apply only to states or whether they apply to individuals. And responsibility is a more modern, relatively modern term. One thing I read said some of the early appearances is in the Federalist Papers, for example. They didn't talk about it very much, and it also has been used a lot in international relations recently. So we do have, this notion of common but differentiated responsibilities, right? We have responsibility to protect. We have corporate social responsibility. And so it's a term that is modern. It's a term that's been used with regard to international relations topics before, and it doesn't, I think, carry quite the same baggage as duties and obligations. So that's why I chose to use it. Now, for lawyers, responsibility does still carry baggage, and the baggage that it carries, people think legal responsibility. Most lawyers who say responsibility, they think legal responsibility, they think liability. So that's why with lawyers, I always have to wave my hands and say, not about legal responsibility, not about liability. And especially when you've written a book called The Justice Cascade, which is all about international criminal accountability and responsibility, you have to say, I believe in individual criminal accountability for some crimes, right? I believe in that for mass atrocity, for example, but I think it's not appropriate. The backward-looking liability model is not appropriate for many of these more current decentralized rights issues.
Thank you so much. Leon actually replied to say he is a lawyer, and thank you for that response. There's a question from an anonymous attendee asking what the correlation is between the right to privacy and international state responsibility. So again, I think that was typed when you were speaking to Dr. Costello. And if you want to talk more broadly about state responsibility versus individual responsibility as it comes up in the book, feel free.
Well, I guess we were, well, I was just talking about, so the main, obviously under international law, state accountability, state responsibility is the main type of responsibility. And so what made the whole issue, my Justice Cascade book, that issue was so important because it was so new that individuals could be held criminally accountable, because the whole UN system, the whole regional human rights court system is based on state responsibility, right? But in terms of the privacy issue, so it's hard. I mean, actually, okay, here I'm going to get Donna more involved. How would you answer that question, Donna? I mean, with regard to privacy, the international law is simply not as clear on this issue of what responsibility states have, right? So as we have the European law has been very far-sighted, but I don't, and it apparently does take privacy from the European Convention for Human Rights, but it goes a long way with that privacy and to reach where it's gone. So, Donna, what would you say to that question?
Yeah, I mean, the tricky thing about international human rights law is the fact that the primary actors traditionally were states. The entire framework was based around this idea of state sovereignty rather than individuals. And that idea of sovereignty has been sort of corroded or eroded over time. And so individuals have more of a place and a say than ever before. And as we were saying earlier, there is this ability now to individually petition and to complain and to seek protection of individual rights as human beings rather than just states. But because of that history, the international human rights treaties don't emphasize the right to privacy to the same degree as some of the more recent treaties that are purely based on individual complaints, like the European Convention on Human Rights, as you say. So there are often kind of rights to family and private life that are recognized in some of the international treaties, like the ICCPR. But because state responsibility was the original foundational principle on the drafting of those, it's been difficult to flesh that out and to define it in practice. But it does become more defined over time as the cases come through, and these are living documents. So obviously, definitions that are created and provided in the 1970s and 80s at the beginning of the kind of the creation and establishment of these treaties and institutions, they will have changed over time. But yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult question. And I suppose if the question is really asking what's the difference between the individual right to privacy and state responsibility in relation to privacy, in an ideal world, those two things are the same, and the right to privacy that an individual has should be protected in the same way by the state. That's not always the case. So, and it does depend on what organization you're going to or what institution you're petitioning to. So the definitions can change as between the EU Charter, the European Convention on Human Rights, the ICCPR, the ICESCR, etc., etc. So again, there is kind of an argument to be made for harmonizing these processes and making the definitions more coherent and consistent. But it's such a good question and so much we could talk about there.
And also, I would just add to that, that rapidly changing technology, of course, all of a sudden we have things that no one imagined, right? That no one imagined. So, you know, when we thought of privacy of family or personal privacy, we thought of things like, you know, of course, search warrants for houses and not, you know, not having your mail opened, right? But all of a sudden, like, how do you translate those norms into this whole modern era? And, you know, people who would be crazy about if you open one of their letters, you know, don't seem to have the same sense about that with regard to their electronic communications. And yet maybe they should. We're learning that they probably should go crazy in the same way as if you opened, you know, just ripped open one of their, you know, a personal letter and read it.
Yeah. So there's another question from Lenovo who asks, or states first, that an ideology protected by freedom of expression led to the attack on the US Capitol and can also lead to crimes against humanity. Do you have any thoughts on this? I'm just wondering, is there more to that? Yeah, no, that's the end of the question.
Okay, so yes, I think I said that you know, the freedom of expression issue is becoming particularly how can I say, is taken on particular importance since the attack on the Capitol. But I would just say, as someone who's looked at the history of human rights violations, there have been many more violations trying to squash freedom of expression than trying to use it. Okay, and so I still believe that, in fact, most parts of the world are suffering from an inability to have any freedom of expression, not from a excess of freedom of expression. So, and you know, even the argument that's you know was made by Trump's lawyers is just kind of patently false. So I don't want to like give too much credence to that argument, right? That it was a freedom of expression argument. It wasn't, you know, he's been expressing himself clearly for 4 years and no one tried to bring this kind of accusation against him, right? It was this particular act that he did. Anyway, so I believe it's really important to protect and defend freedom of expression, and that it's one of the major, you know, challenges we face as human rights activists. But we have to realize, as with all rights, you know, rights are limited by rights of others, and we also have to think about responsibilities as well as rights.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Cueva Cotter says, thank you so much for this insightful talk, and notes that in situations of armed conflict, there is necessarily an interplay between international human rights law and international humanitarian law. What are your views on the extent to which human rights have been sidelined in the security debate so far?
Okay, well, so, you know, when I teach about the International Criminal Court, one of my favorite diagrams is actually one that has 3 circles, you know, and then there's an overlap in the middle. And one circle is human rights law, and one circle is international criminal law, and one circle is the international laws of war, humanitarian law. And then in the middle here, we get something that is the, you know, some people have called it atrocity law, or basically the law governed by the International Criminal Court and the ad hoc tribunals. So this convergence has happened between human rights law, criminal law, and laws of war. And I think it's been productive since those, you know, were productive in terms of the crimes that the ICC has before it, but it also does cause some difficulty over how to do this. And, you know, the big issue, let's say, that I think that the questioners raising is this issue, like, say, of drones, right? And so, but the crucial issues with drones is where's the battlefield? If it's a real battlefield, right, governed by the laws of war, then the drones are kind of our least worry. Okay, there are weapons on that battlefield that are much more dangerous than drones. Okay, the problem with drones is if the battlefield has become the war on terror in the whole world, then we take something, an act that under human rights law or under any domestic law would simply be an assassination or a murder, right? and we get the claim that it is a legitimate act of war. Okay, and that is extremely worrisome. So that's what you're saying. I'm worried about that too, but I think it's not I think it's not so much the problem with the overlapping. I don't think it's so much problem with the law of war overlapping with human rights law. I think it's this definition of the battlefield that is really making things complicated here. And I think it's I think the notion of a war on terror as that the whole world is a battlefield is simply completely untenable. And I think it's not embraced by most international lawyers, and I'll turn to Don on this one too, but most international legal scholars and lawyers don't agree with that. It's been put forward by the some lawyers in the United States, some work for the US government, especially the Bush administration, and it's been endorsed by a number of other countries, mainly for their own political reasons. But I personally believe that it's a very pernicious claim that terrorism can and has been handled effectively through criminal law, domestic and international, and that we'd all be in a much better spot if we were still using criminal law to handle terrorism and not this notion of the war on terror.
Yeah, thank you so much. And there's so much more we could talk about there, but I'm conscious of the time. So I think I'll ask one more question, and possibly two if we have time. There is one more question on privacy, so I can bring Roisin in again on this if you like. And it's actually from another Roisin Finnegan. Do you think there are circumstances where the right to privacy should be curtailed? For example, if it were possible to reveal the identity of someone carrying out a crime by taking a photo which could implicate their criminality, for example, or taking a photo of a boat pushing back migrants at sea, should their right to privacy be upheld over the rights of the migrants in this instance?
Mm-hmm.
And this could apply to many other examples. Does that make sense, or will I see clarification on that?
Yeah. I hope we will get Roisin back in to join us.
Yeah, let's get Roisin in.
Okay.
I think Roisin Finnegan, Roisin's a former student of mine. She provides a bit of clarification later on. She says, basically, are there dangers in having such robust data privacy and protections rights contained within the GPR? And she also says, thanks so much for such an informative talk. Yeah. So Roisin Costello, I'm going to bring you back in on this because you might have some thoughts for Roisin Finnegan. And if not, don't worry, we can move on to another topic.
Okay, so Roisin Costello knows more about this than I do, but let me just say, I feel like the right to privacy has always been tempered by by legitimate state needs, right, for public security and safety. And so that's why, it's not that your house can never be searched, it's that they need a search warrant and they need to have a good reason for getting the search warrant, right? It's not that your phone can't be tapped. It can be. It's that you need to have, you need to get permission to tap it. And so those protections have been diminished over time, at least in the United States, but the notion is still there that you don't have a right to privacy that is, untouchable, that has to be balanced off by needs of the state with evidence, that they show real evidence that particular person's right to privacy can be violated because there's fear. Now on the Roisin, you should jump in, especially on this the migrant issue, because I don't know if I really understand it well or would know what to say there.
You just muted.
Yeah, so I'd echo very much what Kathryn said there. I think in a European context as well, although we have this kind of quite broad right to privacy, especially under the ECHR and the way it's been interpreted, it is necessarily a right that's tempered. So, there are significant kind of, I suppose, loopholes, if you could put it like that deal with how privacy is balanced, in particular against circumstance where there's a threat to rights to life or to kind of bodily safety, and those are pretty well established, I think, in ECHR and Court of Justice case law, in particular in relation to kind of data retention is the context we come across it most frequently. I suppose the problem in relation, the broader problem, I think it's kind of what the migrant example is touching off, is that it sometimes only becomes clear in retrospect that there has been a violation of the other right against which the right to privacy is then balanced. And at that point, it's impossible to kind of wind the clock back and undo the right to privacy or diminish it such that you can reveal the individuals who are at the root of the criminality. So in that respect, I think we end up with probably a more pragmatic issue than the issues of responsibility we're talking about this evening, in that you end up with a question of whether you reduce the right to privacy substantively at its kind of root in order to affect maybe potentially more equal outcomes in branch areas. And that's kind of a fairly kind of slippery slope I wouldn't want to go tripping down. But yeah, that would certainly be my take on it.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much, Roisin, and sorry to put you on the spot there. That's fantastic that you were able to jump in on that. So I suppose with the time left, I would just like to sincerely thank Professor Kathryn Sikkink, and everybody for attending. Kathryn, you're such an influential thinker and a prolific scholar, and this book touches on very important issues relating to human rights protection in the modern era. I'd highly recommend it to anyone with an interest in human rights and the ethics of responsibility in the area of political science as well as law. Kathryn, you're one of the great minds of our time, and you've dedicated much of your life's work to the cause of human rights, and we're so grateful for that, and so grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak to you this evening about your very important work. Is there anything that you wanted to bring in or touch on before we wrap up? Because I'm conscious that we grilled you on so many different areas there, but if there's anything you feel we didn't discuss that you had wanted to bring in, feel free.
Well, first, this book was based on my Castle lectures at Yale University. And so it is, there were 3 lectures delivered over 3 days, and it very much has that feeling to it. It's more informal book. It's not a deeply footnoted book, right? Because it's more like this series of lectures. It's a more conversational tone. But if someone wants the full footnoted version, there is an earlier paper that I wrote with a co-author, Fernando Berdion del Valle, that was published in the Minnesota Journal of International Law, that does the whole law school footnote thing. But it also really traces out this Latin American story I talked about at the very beginning, of the Latin American tradition of combining rights and responsibilities, which is a fascinating story. It's in Latin American constitutions much more. It also talks about something I haven't talked about today, but the one international legal human rights treaty that really speaks about duties is, of course, the African Convention on Human and People's Rights. And so that's also quite interesting, that we have these 2 areas of the global South, Latin America with its American Declaration of Rights and Duties, and then the African Charter of People's Rights. And so, it's not, of course, all uncontroversial. There was some fear about the one reason human rights didn't get into, duties didn't get into the Universal Declaration was there was some fear that it was a reflection of Catholic social doctrine, and some individuals didn't want to bring religion in. But I should just say that the attention to duties is much broader than that. It was actually in socialist thought in Latin America as well as Catholic social doctrine, and it was also in something sort of a civic Republican tradition that focuses on civic virtue, right? And Africa is, of course, a more communitarian approach, trying to sort of root human rights law in African traditions around dignity that would include attention to duties. So I did want to say that there's a lot of interesting things that can be explored, and I would just point people, if you want the full footnoted version, to that article. And I also always try to thank Fernando Berdion del Valle, who's one of the people who was my co-author in that part, really helped me think about these issues. And I thank him very much in the foreword of that book.
It's fantastic. Thank you so much. And I might circulate that article to the attendees after the session.
Okay.
It would be fantastic for everyone to have a chance to read that. So if there's nothing else you'd like to say, I suppose we would wrap up there, and just thank you again sincerely for your time and for the opportunity to talk through these fascinating issues.
Okay, and thank you, Donna, for the invitation. It's really a privilege for me to talk to you and your audience, and Roisin also.
Thanks, Roisin, also.
Okay.
Yes, and thanks everyone. Great. Okay, take care. Thanks, Kathryn.
Take care. Bye now.